Okay, I did ask though, just so, I should know this, but I did ask. Okay, sorry. Let's go back. Everybody, new members, yes, awesome. Welcome everyone else. Now I'm not sure why there's a square in the middle of the screen. Returning members, visitors, and of course our Zoom audience. Yes. I'm not sure why it's showing up here. There's always something that goes a little bit wonky. Sorry. All right. We are so excited to announce the outcomes of the City Nature Challenge, and Peter Hernandez is going to come up. He was the main person responsible, but he worked with some others, and he's going to let you all know how we did.
How we did? Oh, our main sponsor, where's Jane? Jane, where are you? Come up here. And then Jerry, stand up, Jerry, come up. These are all Jane. It took more than just me. Jane was kind of the heart. Jerry came up with some ideas. We implemented them, which was awesome. And we were just shooting to be in Texas, but we actually ended up USA #1. We broke records. Native Plant Society was a big factor in participating, and also not only observations. That's #1 in observations. Yes, we were 3rd in the world globally, internationally. That is, I don't think, at least my recollection, Jerry, I know you've been through this also several years. I don't think any U.S. city has jumped to 3rd place. Now, the only room for us, is to do first. And we have a plan. Hopefully, we do have a path forward for that for next year. I do have some rulers out there to save the date for next year to get involved. We do have a website on here. Jane was that's one of the website looking at anything that comes through and so forth. But yes, so thank you. And also, you see Claire up here, Claire Carter. Yeah, her excited. This is a trophy that she's actually holding, and the Native Plant Society of Texas. And actually, there's more than one society in our area. And but altogether, y'all got the most observations for the community nature challenge. So not only do we have a city nature challenge, but we also had an intra nature challenge going on, and that was the community. And glad to see that the Native Plant Society was a big help and a big sponsor to that. Thank you. It all was teamwork. All right, thank you. Back to you. Oh, one more thing. If you made more than 200, Jane brought pins. You actually got an award, and it's a really neat award saying City Nature Challenge 2024. If you made more than 200 observations. I know Talet, you had one. Over 200. Anybody else? I don't know if anybody else was here. Yep. Oh, okay. Andrea. Okay, so these were more than 200, and I think that was one of the motivations. We also had folks that made over 1,000. Jerry was over 1,000. Jane. I know in species level, the #1 species back there is Joe Wheaton. So over 500 species. 500 and.
You might have passed Joe by now. I don't know. Y'all are very
close. Right. So as data comes in, it does get analyzed, because one of the things that we really want to do is the fidelity of the data. The fidelity of the data is, yes, we're making observations, we're critiquing it, we're making it research grade. We want to make it research grade for the researchers in the background. There's Texas Parks and Wildlife that uses it. I know there's PhD folks that use it out of UTSA. So us being a very fidelity about our data is very good. And I think that's one of the big difference between the US and the two countries that were #2 and #1 is that fidelity. We are very, it's not data in, data garbage in, garbage out. I hate to say that, but ours is, it's going to be used. It's going to be used for policy making. It's going to be used for analyzing what's there, what's not there. And I always say, conserve. In order to conserve, you got to observe. But one thing I've learned from this session is you got to, once you observe, you can start preserving. You know where to preserve a little bit more better. So that's it in my show. Back to Lee. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
That's awesome. And since the folks on Zoom didn't see this, here's the trophy. Okay. So we have an upcoming 4th Saturday Nature Walk series. It is Go Native, Natives for Your Landscape. This is a really great opportunity to see some of the plants right around this area that are really good in your residential landscape settings, more formal landscape designs. It's going to be on June 22nd from 8 to 10 here, meeting here, and it's going to be led by Joan Miller and Drake White. And we've got some really exciting news. We've got a couple of demonstration gardens. The first one that we got involved with is a demonstration garden at Rainbow Gardens on Bandera Road. And so we want to thank all of the volunteers and Rainbow Gardens for letting us create this demonstration garden. And Teresa Maslanka and Haley Giambalvo were instrumental leaders in this effort. You can see some of our volunteers here, and it's a really beautiful garden. So go take a look. It's at 8516 Bandera Road. Oh, and I should say, Brandon Kirby already let us know that the presence of this garden and the plants, which have signs, you can see there in the photo on the right, that describe those plants. He said that he's already seeing a difference in the native plants selling. So selling more, selling quicker, and there's more awareness. So it's really awesome. And then we also just started phase 1 of another demonstration garden. This is at Pollinatives in Converse. And so we want to thank the volunteers involved there and Pollinatives for letting us have a demonstration garden there. This is at 101 South Street in Converse. So please go check it out. It's got a little pathway you can see there in the photo on the right. It's right off of the parking lot. And we want to acknowledge all of the volunteers that helped make this happen. They're all listed here. I'm not going to name them all. I hope I didn't miss anybody here, but thank you so much. We couldn't do it without all of these volunteers helping with the planting and the maintenance that we've done so far. We also want to thank the volunteers that participated in the Society Day at Rainbow Gardens recently. That's the first time that I got to see the garden in action, and this was actually happening that day while we were there for Society Day, promoting native plants. You see mealy blue sage, and you see a beautiful black swallowtail, telling you why you need to buy that mealy blue sage, right? So thanks to the volunteers there. It was a really hot day, but we had a lot of good interactions with people and helped to influence some plant decisions that were made that day. Speaking of demonstration gardens, we are also looking for more volunteers. If you're interested in participating and supporting either of these demonstration gardens, please reach out to us at nipsotsavolunteers@gmail.com. We also have a call for volunteers. We're looking for just a couple of people to help support Joan and I on June 21st at Confluence Park for the Twilight Farmers Market. There are going to be a lot of different local vendors with food and vegetables and who knows what else. We're going to be there with our chapter booth with information about our chapter, about our organization. And we're going to be giving away the seeds, the pollinator plant of the year, clammy weed seeds, and our bookmarks, of course. So if you're interested in volunteering, June 21st, the actual event is from about 6 to 10, but we're not planning on staying the whole time. We're planning on being there about 6 to 8. And reach out again to nipsotsavolunteers@gmail.com. Okay, did I miss any announcements? I feel like I missed an announcement. Yes, Pam. Oh, we're looking for volunteers. Okay, so for the 4th, I knew that was something. The 4th Saturday, let me go back just so I get the date right. Sorry. 22nd, Joan says. She's on top of it. Yeah, because I have to go all the way to the beginning. 22nd from 8 to 10. We're looking for a couple of volunteers to help. We're going to be doing a seed giveaway too at a table with our information while the walk is going on. So if you're interested, please reach out again to that same NIPS.SA. Hold on. NIPS.SAvolunteers@gmail.com. All right, so our next chapter meeting is June 25th, and Marjeska Brown from Great Springs Project will be presenting a fragile green thread and a trailblazing way to protect it. So you don't want to miss that. This is an amazing project underway. And tonight's meeting is Land Stewardship for Birds, a guide for Central Texas. We've got Rufus Stephens here, and he's a certified wildlife biologist and retired Texas Parks and Wildlife Department district leader for the Edwards Plateau, very huge region. And while I close this down and pull his up, just hold on with this. Okay, I think I have it ready for you, Rufus.
All right.
Welcome.
Thank you.
And you feel free to pull that off or lift that
Right.
up if you need to.
Yep. All right, thank you. So, actually, to kind of, excuse me, it's not.
So let's see what happened here.
So we were saying if we share the whole screen, then that'll work, make my PDF work.
Which one did you?
The blue one? Share. And then we're going to start that. And we got our little box there. Maybe. Yes. Got the little box. Well, thank you. Actually, I know a number of y'all, Jerry and David. And so actually, I started working as an urban biologist with Texas Parks and Wildlife in San Antonio. So do I have any master naturalists out there? Can I see hands for? All right. Actually, so Debbie Reed and I helped start. We basically together, along with Judith and Mary Caparino. Actually, Debbie and Mary Caparino were they were with the San Antonio Parks and Rec at forget the name of the park. Frederick Park, yes. And so actually, so one of the things after I left the urban program, I was still with Texas Parks and Wildlife. I went up to the Boerne area and actually was working, had my office at Cibolo Nature Center, worked with Jan Wrede. And how many people know Jan? Anybody know Jan Wrede? And so Jan and I collaborated on a bunch of workshops, and we did a whole series for people that were interested in managing their property for wildlife tax valuation. And we focused on birds. We we started with 1 day, and then we went to 2, and we realized that wasn't enough. We went to 3. And Jan and people were going, one of the things is that we were telling people, okay, you go to this book for this information, go for this book for this information, and you kind of combine the two to figure out what you're going to do. And people were like going, can't you put that in one place? And Jan said the other day, and I don't remember this, but she said, oh, let's do a brochure. Well, the brochure turned into a 500 page book and took us about 12 years to do. Texas A&M Press was great at supporting us through that time. We both had life kind of get in the way. And so, but I want to ask another question. So we know how many master naturalists. We know everybody's here with a Native Plant Society. Anybody have more than an acre of land that they're working with? Okay, a few. And anybody have land that they own elsewhere than in San Antonio, like another county somewhere? Okay. So you might be interested in the wildlife tax value aspect of it. But really what we're interested in, and you as native plant people, I want you to think about, and we tend to think about individual plants. I want you to think about plant communities, because that's habitat and that's what birds are adapted to. And one of the reasons we select birds is because they are representative. They're very diverse and can really represent a diversity of habitat and the quality of the habitat. So one of the things I'm going to try to do today is have you understand a little bit about, recognize healthy and unhealthy, and I'm focusing just on a couple of habitat types, grassland and live oak savanna, because that's mostly what we have around here. And I want to inspire you to use those native plant communities and manage those native plant communities as bird habitat. So what we're going to do is we're going to go over, I'm going to just touch on what is land stewardship. I'm going to talk about birds as indicators for success, which I already alluded to a little bit. We're going to talk about some examples of habitats and the requirements for those bird species. And then at the end, if we have time, we're going to talk about, and I'm going to try to go pretty fast so that we will have time, I'm going to talk about a stewardship technique. And it's going to be one of these. And so you might look at that and kind of go, which would I like to hear about? So this is kind of an audience-directed portion of the presentation. So we have brush control, bird survey techniques, deer management. Anybody have deer? Grassland management. So what is, and so that'll come back up. We'll be back to that at the end of the presentation. So what is stewardship? Basically, it's the careful and responsible management of land entrusted to one's care. And Texas is 97% privately owned. What private landowners do makes a difference to wildlife habitat, to native plants. It's up to private landowners. Not like in the West, where 40 or 50% of the land is in, our federal land. It's primarily private land here in Texas. And that means also that private landowners have a tremendous responsibility when it comes to protecting that land and caring for it. So what we want you to do is we want you to be better land stewards for birds. So why birds? I alluded to a little bit of this. One thing is birds are charismatic. Plants are too. Don't get me wrong. But birds are charismatic. And they also, as I said, they do represent diversity. So when we manage and can manage for a diversity of birds, then we know that the plant community is rich and diverse as well. So it works both ways. And basically, when birds flourish, all other types of wildlife flourish. Okay. So, and it's fairly easy. When we go out and we do things for birds, improve habitat, then they respond readily. But the big thing is birds need our help. Okay. This was a paper that was published in Science in 2019, and basically it was kind of a metadata type research paper, and it was meaning that it took a bunch of different research projects, brought them together, and sort of looked at the consequences of all those. So there were things like breeding bird survey data, which is really robust. There are breeding bird survey blocks all over North America. That's one of the data. And actually, when we were writing our book, I mean, this is in 2019, this is our second edition of our book. And when we were writing the first edition, we realized as we were selecting birds to put in the book that many of them were in trouble. The breeding bird survey data, and I was constantly looking at breeding bird survey data, was showing that those birds were in trouble. So this paper estimated that 3 billion birds, and that's abundance, so out of the population, was lost since the 1970s. And that's about a 30% decline in birds. And when we look at it, this is also from that same paper in Science. And when you look at it, you see that it's almost all kinds of bird habitats. All biomes in North America have lost, except for one, have lost birds. Now, coastal, actually, the bar is the statistical, the confidence interval for that data. And so for coast, you can see it swings pretty wildly. But for other birds, you know, arid lands, eastern deciduous forests, Arctic tundra, grasslands, which I'm sure as native plant people, you realize that grasslands are some of the most endangered habitat types we have. In Texas, I mean, we have just a fraction of a percent of blackland prairie, you know, of our historic blackland prairie still left. But one of the interesting, or one of the really concerning things is that you'll see two bars in there that relate to forest generalists and habitat generalists. And these are birds that tend to be very adaptable. Generalists mean that they can switch their diet. And I joke that, you know, maybe our best example in an urban setting are grackles. They eat at Taco Cabana, they eat at McDonald's, they go get under cars at HEB, they drink, you know, irrigation water. They're great generalists. Now, grackles are not in decline. There's no trouble with grackles, but that's an example of a generalist. They're very adaptable. And to see that bird populations, you know, that these generalist bird populations had declined is very concerning. The one exception is wetlands. And Jan says, never ask your audience to guess what you're thinking, but anybody know why that wetlands might, since the 1970s, might not? Ducks Unlimited. So if you remember, well, you may not, but that in the 60s, duck populations began to fall significantly. And it was draining the wetlands, farming wetlands, draining wetlands. Farm program had a ton to do with it. And organizations like Ducks Unlimited sprang up. Well, there was a big initiative that was done at that time in the late 60s, early 70s. It was called the North American Waterfowl Management Plan. And it was NGOs like Ducks Unlimited, but it was organizations, state and federal, and they all came together, and Congress passed money to spend on conserving habitat. They got it into the farm program, and so they tried to encourage farmers not to drain wetlands, especially in the prairie pothole country. But it was everywhere. It was not only there, but in the wetlands between the prairie pothole country and the Dakotas and the Texas coast, but it included the Texas coast and like the Panhandle of Texas, the Playa Lakes region. So that initiative was extremely successful. So here is the only example of these groups of birds that got turned around was because we paid attention to it, we made a plan, and we implemented that plan. So that's the bright side of this disappointing data, is that it can be turned around. If we want to do something about it, we can, and we can change that. So for me, kind of one of the poster child birds for beautiful birds is painted bunting. Anybody seen a painted bunting before? Yeah, and so pretty common, right? Relatively common bird. I like to think of it as really a Texas bird. It's not as much of a Texas bird as golden cheek warblers, which they're all born in Texas in the hill country, but definitely a Texas bird. Yeah, it's also in Oklahoma. But if you look at it, that's the breeding bird survey data, and so you can see how concentrated painted buntings are in Texas. Okay, and so this is their stronghold. Well, this is a statewide data for painted buntings in statewide in Texas. And that's about a 30% decline in birds. So they're still common. Most of y'all have seen a painted bunting, so they're still common. But there was somebody at Parks and Wildlife, it's probably John Heron, but who said our job as biologists is to keep common birds common. So how can we do things we don't want them to get to an endangered status before we do anything about it. We should be doing it before then. So we want to keep common birds common. So it's not like, oh, it's still okay, so let's just, we'll wait until it really gets bad before we do something about it. This is kind of the canary in the mine shaft example. So, and so that's very concerning, but an upside is, does anybody have a wildlife? I know someone's got a wildlife tax valuation. Few people. And so in Texas, if you have an ag valuation, you can switch and go do a wildlife valuation, and that you basically get the same tax rate that you would as if you managed for cattle or for cotton or whatever. And that changed in 96, and you can see this data goes through 2017, and the number of acres that have so now we're well over 5 million acres that are under wildlife management. So this is a great opportunity. These people can really work together, and their focus of their management for their property, for their ag, is wildlife. So that's really a very bright spot, especially in Texas. And you go, well, hasn't 2022 data come out yet? Well, actually, I just checked with them a few weeks ago. This is from a data. It's called Texas Land Trends. It's from the Texas A&M Natural Resource Institute. And so it's really cool site. I'm kind of a geek about data, so I really like it. But it gives you a lot of neat information, and this is one of the information. But they haven't even completed the data, compiling the data for 2022. So that's why it's not on there, and it should be out pretty soon, and then we'll have that data. But I expect it to be a significant jump. So land stewardship for birds. So the first thing to do is identify, when you're managing for birds, is identify the habitat or the plant communities that you have. What are the different types? What's the quality of those habitats? The next is to, once you have those habitats, is to look at the birds that utilize those habitats, pick 2 or 3 species. They should be species that you already have, but you may realize that you don't have as much of abundance for those species as you might want. And so they can become your target. So for your habitat type. So they're kind of your measure for success. Then you determine the type of stewardship practices you're going to implement. 1, that the bird needs, but 2, it relates to the quality of your habitat. If you've got, invasive plants, it's covered up in KR bluestem, you want to address those. That may be part of addressing the concerns in your habitat and improving it for those target species. Jan likes to say that you need to be prepared to be your own best advisor. Look and listen, ask questions, keep learning. You're here tonight, so keep learning. Find trusted advisors. Jan used to say that I was one of her trusted advisors, and used to. But and then make science-based decisions, right? It's fun to be able to hear from your neighbor and what they think or what they've observed, but anecdotal information can really get you in a bad, making decisions that aren't necessarily founded and will be the most productive. So make science-based decisions. Our book, the first 6 chapters are on different habitat types. Actually, chapter 6 is about backyards. And then we devote the next 3 chapters to what we see as really big issues in Central Texas. One is, basically predators and other dangerous animals. We'll talk a little bit more about that in just a second. Deer management. Deer are huge, and actually there are endangered species biologists, golden cheek warbler biologists, experts in it, and they think that deer may be the most impactful thing to golden cheek's habitat. Basically, they're preventing the regeneration of deciduous trees, so live oak or Spanish oak, black cherry, even hackberry, and that's a really important component of golden cheek habitat. And does anybody know Mark Peterson? He used to be a forester. He worked and then more recently he's worked for SAWS. A really intelligent, bright guy. And Mark, basically, when I moved to this part of the country, he said what struck him when he moved here was, where are the sapling? Where are the seedlings? Where are the saplings? They're not out there. And he said, that's a slow train wreck, right? And when we go into drought situations like we've had the past couple of years, we've lost, on some property that I help manage, we've lost dozens of post oaks and live oaks to hypoxylon. Basically, they were stressed, and the drought pushed them over the edge. And the hypoxylon pushed them over the edge. But that's so if we don't have any regeneration, and for post oaks, it's just not out there if you've got any number of deer. And so that's why deer management, in a nutshell, is so important. And then cedar and other brush. So, obviously a lot of the hill country, actually, if you read early Spanish explorer accounts of coming through this country, it is wide open country. They had antelope and bison. And you look out there today and you go, a bison couldn't survive out there. An antelope couldn't survive. And one of the things for me, a prairie chicken. There used to be prairie chickens around here. Prairie chickens need really open grassland habitat. That is not what we have today, right? So brush, especially in this area, cedar has really changed the landscape from a habitat community standpoint. Those dangerous critters for birds, red imported fire ants, and we often use the acronym, and you'll see in some of the slides that I use forward, is RIFA, red imported fire ants. They are a huge problem. Most birds are, I'll go ahead and say that, but I'm going to show you a slide basically alluding to the importance of insects. But most birds use insects, especially when they're feeding young. So right this time of year, even birds like cardinals that we think of as seed eaters are feeding insects to their young. So insects are important. The problem with fire ants, they're competing for those same insects, and they decrease insect diversity wherever they're present. Okay, so they're a problem for birds. Cats, I'll mention a little bit about that in a minute, but feral hogs, we've actually got an estimated number. AgriLife Extension says there's as many feral hogs in Texas as there are all white-tailed deer. That's about 3.5 million. And then brown-headed cowbirds are kind of a special case. This is really kind of getting into the real deep dive into birds that impact other birds and why they do. And we might talk about that a little bit more. It's a pretty controversial issue. But house cats. Joey Fisher-Hine is an artist, a master naturalist in the San Antonio chapter, and she did this painting and called it Silent Spring, 4 billion, one and counting. It's estimated that between 2.5 billion and 4 billion birds are killed every year by house cats. So or all kinds of cats, feral cats, house cats, all of them together. And so there are research projects. There was a research that was done and to me, it's really one of the most telling research projects on the impact of feral cats. And it was done in like Ohio in a rural setting. And basically they were finding that cats were killing more wildlife, and basically only about 30% of their diet is birds, or what they catch and kill is birds. And so they kill lizards and snakes and all kinds of and insects, all kinds of other stuff. So, but in this research project in Ohio, in a rural setting, they found that cats killed more wildlife than all other mammalian predators combined. So that's foxes, raccoons, coyotes, bobcats, just house cats, just cats were killing more than all those other mammal predators combined. So that's concerning. Here's the slide I was alluding to. So forbs, we call it, biologists call them forbs, broadleaf flowering plants. They aren't all necessarily wildflowers, but they are food for birds, and they're also food for insects. I mean, pollinators are big these days. Everybody's talking a lot about pollinators, and they should. And as a surrogate for all other kinds of insects, that's great. And but also insects are also food for birds, right? So the importance of native plants in the plant community provides insects, and it also is providing food for birds, both in the form of insects, but also in the forms of seeds from those plants. So, you know, some native plant communities, you know, this is a live oak savanna, and this is bird habitat. This is where they get those basic components of habitat: food, water, shelter, and space. And if we looked at a particular, and so I'm going to talk a little bit about grasslands first, and then I'll talk about live oak savannas. Anybody have feed thistle and get lesser goldfinches? We get a bunch of lesser goldfinches at our place in Boerne, and they are one of those birds. It's actually declined by about 50 or 60%, the population of lesser goldfinches, and they are here year round. They're one of our birds, and so because of that decline, they are what we would call a priority bird. This is a terminology that's used a lot in the bird conservation community. They talk about species in need of the species of greatest need of conservation, and they talk about priority birds. And so we used breeding bird survey data and stuff from Partners in Flight and Texas Parks and Wildlife, and that's where we get our ratings for priority birds. But one of the things to think about, so looking at it, they really need like open grassy habitat. And so when you look down at the kinds of thing, what are the type of stewardship practices you can do? Prescribed burning is the best. And I have a great example that's coming up actually, or mow and bale. But mow and bale is only marginally better than doing nothing at all, okay? But prescribed burning is much, much better. Of course, I've threatened to burn our backyard, and my wife's not real keen on that. But managing grazers is also really important on that. And so light to moderate rotational grazing, moving them from pasture to pasture is really important. So what is, let me back up. So this is an example of a healthy grassland. One of the things to look at is that you'll notice that there are different colors green in there. And so most of that's grasses. This actually happens to be at Cibolo Nature Center, and is a tall grass prairie. And, but you'll see there's different colors of green, and that relates to different species. There's lots of switchgrass, but there's also eastern gamma grass. And yes, the light colored, the kind of straw colored plant in there is KR bluestem. I think it's something we just have to live with. It's here. But you'll also notice here in the foreground are, you know, there's some forbs in there, some wildflowers. So it's a diverse setting. This is not diverse. Now, even though it's a winter shot, look at it and you don't see any residual wildflowers that were left, no dried flowers left behind. So the diversity here is extremely low. This is a KR bluestem field. But let me show you another example. Here's a really nice look down. So when we look across, we kind of can look right past the wildflowers or the forbs. And so look down and you see in healthy grassland, you see several things. And I talk about this and I forget to sort of explain it to people, but you want places for forbs to grow. You want places to grass to grow. You do not want much litter on the ground, and you want to see bare ground, because that's where wildflowers are going to be able to put their seeds and germinate. And if you don't have bare ground, then you don't have places for wildflowers to germinate. So that's really important. But also there's birds like Buick's wrens. 97% of their diet are insects. And not only that, but they pick them up off the ground. If you don't have bare ground, they can't pick up insects, okay? So that's really important. Here's unhealthy grassland on the left. And so you can see that one of the things is you don't see any bare ground. You see a tremendous amount of thatch. You see a good amount of grass, but really no forbs as compared to the picture on the right. So that composition, so it's you need to also, in evaluating the health of your habitat, is to look down and look at that structure. That's why when I said that mowing's only marginally better than doing nothing at all, is because it takes that litter and it throws it on the ground, and that thatch will not break down very fast. Okay, so it's not like it creates a lot of open ground. And that's the difference in these two spots. They are within 150 feet of each other, the very same field, very same soil. The only difference is the one on the right had a prescribed burn done 2 years ago. The one on the left has not in recent memory, maybe the past 150 years, has not had a prescribed burn done on it. So that's the difference. And it's amazing. I could talk about the bird diversity, but we do a bird survey in the field that hasn't burned yet, and we're barely counting any winter grassland birds. But then this past winter, we went and just did one pass through this burn field and saw more birds than we had seen in the past 2 years in 15 different transects on this property. So it's phenomenal, the benefit that it can have. So what are just some of the plants? I mean, how many plants, native plants, are in a native patch of grassland? A lot more than this, right? Hundreds of plants. So this is just a sampling of some of those plants that we that you want to see in a healthy grassland. So the next one is for painted buntings and live oak savannas. One of the things is to look at is 5 acres. One of the information, and this comes from what we call our bird summaries. And these bird summaries have information on more detailed information than this, but it talks about the basic habitat needs. And one of them, and this is one of those pieces of data that you have to go out and search for and find, is what's their territory size. So it's 1 pair per 5 acres. So if you got 20 acres of live oak savanna and you got 4 nesting pairs of painted buntings, you're pretty much full, right? That's it. But if you have 20 acres, you have 1 pair, you have space to improve that. Okay, so that might be a great bird in that situation to use as an indicator, so and be able to use to go, am I improving the quality of the habitat? The other thing is 2 other things. One is that you'll see that it nests 3 to 5 feet off the ground. So 3 to 5 feet is the primary area that it nests. So, but deer, and so one of the things is control deer overpopulation. Deer can browse between what? I mean, up to about 5 feet. So they actually eat up the habitat that painted bunting. So otherwise it could be good habitat, but basically you're losing the actual layers in the habitat that are important for this bird to nest. So that's really important. Here, oh, let me back up. Here's a nice, healthy live oak savanna. You'll see that, you know, kind of challenge you to see all the different plants. There's shin oak in here. There's elbow bush. There's a Texas redbud in there. There is, I think there's a Carolina buckthorn in there. There's a hackberry in there, and there's live oaks in the background. So this is really diverse habitat, be great painted bunting habitat. You notice it doesn't have a browse line. So, you know, and there's diversity of plants from right at ground level all the way up. And so that's really what you want to look for. That's not healthy habitat. And that's actually two things did this: goats and deer. And the other thing to notice in here is, see those little mounds that are out there? Fire ants. So red imported fire ants. So that's an extremely unhealthy, not to mention, are there any other trees than live oaks there? No, that's the only tree that's there. So here's an example again. There's, you know, should be hundreds. This is just a brief list of some of the plants that we should have in a healthy live oak savanna. So what about plants that are found in backyards? This is my joke: Plateau live oak and St. Augustine. I mean, and there's a lot of those yards around there, isn't there? They don't have to be, right? And as y'all know, I'm sure that all of y'all have gardens that represent this kind of diversity. But the thing to think about is, again, those same principles that apply to a 100,000 acre wildlife management area or you know, a quarter acre backyard. It is those same ecological principles apply. Diversity, we want to have a diversity of plants, a diversity of layers of those plants. You want to have winter plants as well as summer plants. You want to have spring blooming plants as well as fall blooming plants. I mean, when you think of pollinators, but birds are the same way. So, but we can have a fairly formal, doesn't have to be like my yard, which the neighbors go, oh, that's the biologist yard. But it can be more formal and still meet those requirements. So, so actually backyard, didn't hit it again. Anybody not have black crested titmice? And so why would it be a priority bird? Basically, about 50% of the population or more, probably more like 70% of the population, is in Central Texas. What we do for this bird matters. And so they don't just eat, you know, seeds at your seed feeder, but they eat tons of insects as well. Because they're so associated with our backyards, keeping feeders is important. Keeping feeders clean is important. As well as keeping cats indoors. So if you got cats, you want to take them outside, put them on a leash. My big point would be spay and neuter your pets. We do not need additional, especially feral cats out there. And if you want to give them an outdoor experience, you can have a catio. Has anybody heard of catios? If you hadn't, you can Google that. So, so that's really important especially for urban birds. So basically the steps to stewardship for birds was to identify the habitats. Those are native plant communities, the different types that you have, the quality, determine a few species to represent each habitat type, because you don't want to be overwhelmed. It's not trying to monitor every bird that's out there. It doesn't have to be. Just a few of the right type will really help you work as a measure for the success of your improving habitat, and then determine the practices that you're going to do. So, so basically I covered overview of land stewardship. What is that? We talked about birds as indicators for success and why do we care about birds? And then we also talked about some examples of habitats. And if I had, so if I've got a little bit of time, we can go through and so we can go through one of these techniques or look, at least dive into it a little bit. It's sort of like, these are like 4 presentations within this presentation. So I don't think we'll get past one of them, but we'll pick one of them. So I'm going to just ask for a show of hands. How many people want to see brush control? Do you have a question?
Yeah, a few slides back, we were talking about the requirements for, you said cavity, like 13 inches. So what is a cavity?
Oh, good question. Great question. So what's a cavity? And so we talked. Oh, okay. So the question was, what's a cavity? But I had mentioned that it's on the screen. It said, you know, to maintain cavities. Cavities are holes made in trees. So these are birds that when we provide a supplement for that, we're providing a birdhouse or a nest box, same thing. And the cavities typically are made, so woodpeckers, fortunately, for the birds that like to use cavity, make a surplus of holes. So a male woodpecker will make a hole and go, honey, you like this one? And she goes, no. He goes, honey, you like this one? She goes, no. But the other birds get to use the other ones that they already made. So actually at our yard, our yard, we had an American sycamore that died in a drought shortly after we bought it. It died. I'm a biologist. I left it standing, okay? And that's called, a standing dead tree is a snag. And so I left the snag, and actually the woodpeckers drilled several holes in it before it fell down. And the Carolina chickadees made nests in there and nested in that tree. They are actually a whole ecosystem unto themselves as standing dead trees. So that's really, really important. But you know, we shouldn't we shouldn't confuse that providing supplemental nest boxes is the way to manage cavity nesting birds in native habitat. We need to be looking at those standing dead trees that people go, aren't you going to take those down? And we should be saying, no, we're not. That's habitat. And so they're important feeding sites, they're important nesting sites, but we just kind of got to look at them differently. So yeah, good question. So how many people want to see brush control? A few. Bird survey techniques? A few. This may be deer management. A few. Grassland management? Okay. Y'all are kind of all over the place. One of the things that I'll tell you, so how many people, is anybody familiar, other than you, Jerry, is anybody else familiar with Map My Property? Anybody heard of Map My Property? It's done by Texas Forest Service. Okay. I'm going to do grassland management because I'm a geek and I love Map My Property. Okay. And basically what it is it puts the power of GIS, geographical information systems, in the hands of everyday people. So we're going to do grasslands. So some grassland management techniques. And one of the first things I'm going to talk about is Map My Property. So it's a great tool for identifying. So you don't have to have a big piece of property. So maybe you work with a green space in town, a park, a natural area, you know, Phil Harburger Park. But it may be a local park. And you may want to be able to have a better understanding of that piece of property. And one of the ways to do that is to do remote sensing. And that's what GIS is all about. So this is Map My Property. They have a little tutorial when you open it up and you can go through that tutorial. But I'm going to jump to a couple things. So one of the things is you can enter a location, and on the right-hand side, you see layers. I clicked on that little stack of looks like stack of papers above it, and that brings up these layers. So it shows contours, it shows flood zones. Hydrology is basically watersheds, it's streams. And then we have watersheds, and then wet areas. They don't seem to map wet areas very well. And then the last one is parcels. So this is appraisal district data. And this is something 10 years ago you couldn't get. And now you can. And on this, you click on that, you click on parcels, and this is the appraisal district data. So you don't have to guess where your property is. The boundary is already there. Now they have those circles in there. I don't know why those are there. You can easily reproduce the boundary of your property without going, it goes to this tree, and then is that our fence line? And so this is really great for being able to figure out where your place is. So what you can do is then you can mark out your piece of property, and you draw a boundary around it, and then you click on themes. I've gone down to one of the tabs. It's on the left-hand side, and I went to themes, and I got soils. And I'm going into the weeds here, folks. And you get soils, and you can see this is actually over at the Cibolo Nature Center, and there are 3 main soil types there. And it tells you how many acres, what percentage they are, how many acres of each soil type. And you can clip that, and you can get also at the very bottom of the theme, you'll see that you can get a summary, or you can get full. If you click on full, then you get this. And this is so this is showing the different types of soils, but one of the things there in blue, right at we're seeing kind of 2 pages. At the bottom of page 2, you'll see that it says ecological class ID, right there. And if you click on that, you get the ecological site description, which is awesome. Is anybody, so I used to, when I started my career, it was all paper soil surveys. Anybody used a paper soil survey from the NRCS, used to be called the Soil Conservation Service. So here's the ecological site, and this is actually for the clay pan website, ecological site. It's kind of a little too small, but you'll get the idea here. So if you go down, actually, it's probably about 20 pages long. I just picked 5 key pages out of it. It's like 20 to 30 pages long. This part right here, ecological dynamics, that's totally ecologist gem, in the sense that it talks about what are the important ecological factors, grazing and fire in this habitat type that made it what it was. And it will say what would be the dominant plants in that habitat type. So this is really interesting stuff. Maybe just for an ecologist. But you'll also see, I kind of scrolled down too far too fast. Oh, maybe I messed up. I'll just go down. There was also another section about state transitions and some more ecological information. But one of the things that's really valuable is you go up here and they have a list. And this is the list that they estimate is the historic plant community that would occur on these soil types. And so if you look at it, you'll see that, and I apologize for it being too small, but the number 1 and number 2 are big blue stem and Indian grass. Those are, so it is tall grass prairie. And so those should be the dominant plants. If you have this soil type and you go out there and you only have a little bit of little blue stem and no big blue stem and no Indian grass, then you know that it is, in a diminished state. So the quality is not what it was historically. Now, are we trying to bring back everything to what it was pre-European settlement? No, but what it does give you is a really good way to look at that plant community and say, is it healthy? Am I headed in the right direction? If I know that tall grass prairie species are the dominant grasses, and you start seeing those come in, you know you're headed in the right direction. The other thing is you'll see it mentions a bunch of different kinds of grasses, but then it also goes into forbs. And here's a whole list of forbs. And so people will ask me, and now I do consulting, and I retired from Parks and Wildlife, and I do consulting, and people will hire me and they go, well, you know, I've got this old field or this KR field, and I want to reset it. I want to start over and get back to a more native prairie situation. And so what do I plant? And so they hire me and they pay me $125 an hour to go to the soil survey and get this information and come back, because you're not even Native American Seed, which is a wonderful seed company, right? And I'm sure that y'all all are familiar with Native American Seed, but they're a wonderful seed company, but they do not have a limitless supply of seed. So you're going to have a basic plant community, a seed mix that you're going to plant in that plant community. And on that particular site, and this is the information that I would go to get that information. So you can do it on your own. Let me see if I can close that. I wonder if I can get back to my presentation. Let's see. Maybe right there. Okay. So you can also get this information from Web Soil Survey, which is run by the Department of Agriculture with the Natural Resources Conservation Service, NRCS, and which is part of the USDA. It's not as friendly as Map My Property. Map My Property is way more friendly, user friendly. They're just, it's really the way to go. So here's actually back to our healthy grassland, tall grass prairie at the Cibolo Nature Center. And what are some of the common stewardship techniques? Replanting is one, mowing, which I kind of already described a little bit, burning, prescribed grazing. So one of the things with native grass seed, you do not want to plant it too deep. That's a big trick, right? If you're going to plant more than an acre, you need to do it where you don't plant it very deep, because you plant it more than 3/4 of an inch deep, those seeds aren't going to survive. So if you're going to drill it, you need to get a grass drill. And actually, Parks and Wildlife have grass drills, and you can work with Parks and Wildlife, and they can help you with getting a grass drill to do grass seeding. And that's exactly what this is. This is actually on the Cibolo Nature Center on the farm side of the property. And this is actually a grass planting they did there about 3 years ago. Mowing, as I mentioned, is kind of only marginally better than doing nothing at all, but that is the TxDOT approach, right? That's the TxDOT approach. And I'll talk about that in a second. But, you know, yeah, it takes down a lot of material, but it leaves a lot of trash on the ground. And if you go over mesquite, it just pisses it off, okay? It just makes it mad. And here's what it looks like, just tons of litter on the ground. Where are the wildflowers going to grow and something like that? So you go, well, maybe baling. What if you baled it? Then you take that litter away. Well, that only works just a little bit. But, you know, of course, TxDOT does do, and they have pretty good success with wildflowers on the right of way, right? But they basically start and it's what I call the TxDOT approach. They start and usually around the 4th of July, unless the contractor gets a wild hair and starts earlier than that, starts mowing flowers before they've gone to seed. And then you mow, their contracts say they mow 2 to 4 times before first frost. So in November, and then they don't mow after that. That's basically how TxDOT manages the roadsides. Besides planting KR blue stem, which was a huge mistake, but you can do the same thing and sort of create a textile meadow. You can do that, and it's pretty good for annuals, and it's okay for some perennials. Obviously, it's not great for something like Maximilian that tends to bloom in the fall because you're mowing it at that time of year. So, but here's our mowing thing. But if you could do prescribed burning, and this is Mary Humphrey burning out in Ozona area, you get much more bare ground. So this is just weeks after a prescribed burn. And you see the grasses coming back up. You see germination of forbs there. You see bare ground for more forbs to germinate and birds to feed on. I can't overemphasize the importance of that. So here's just an example from the Cibolo Nature Center of some of the plots that we were monitoring. I was helping them monitor there. And when they burned, it dramatically changed. The amount of bare ground went way up. The amount of grass went down. That was because there wasn't anything else prior to that. I mean, or there was much less. The amount of forbs goes up to almost 60%. And you see it fade over time. Now, I think 2004 was maybe a wet year, and that's why the forbs kind of went up, but it fades over time. So cattle or livestock, you know, you might look at that and go, well, that doesn't look too bad, you know, all that Indian blanket there. Well, they've eaten out all the grass, so there's really not much diversity there. So my wife goes, you know, we used to drive through the country before I married you, and I didn't have, you know, just it was in bliss, and it's like, oh, look at that beautiful field. And then she gets with me, and then it's like, oh, look at that, that's terrible, you know, the management's horrible there. And she says, now I just, you know, it's totally been ruined for her. So that's the downside of marrying a biologist. So grazing systems. So there's several different grazing systems. 2 pastures, 1 herd is probably just the most basic. You get some kind of rest. Most systems are headed toward multiple pastures and even more pastures, and they are trying to imitate, and if you think about it, what they're trying to do is they're trying to imitate grazing by migratory herds of animals like bison. So they didn't stay in the same spot. They grazed real heavily for a while and then be in huge herds, and then they would move on to a new territory, and they may not come back to that spot and especially at the same time of year for several years. Okay, and so it had really important, that's really important. So actually you'll probably get the idea here. So if you have 4 pastures and you start by grazing 1 pasture in January and April, and then you go May through August and September through December, that's a year. So you didn't graze all your pastures. Now you move up, and the pasture that was rested the entire year, that's where you rotate it. So what ends up happening is you don't graze the same pasture at the same time every year. You do it, you're staggering it. So one year it's grazed in the spring, the next year it's grazed in the summer, the next year it's grazed in the fall, and then you come back. More like bison, right? They're not grazing it all the time every year. If you do that, if you graze every spring, you shift the plant community to plants that will survive not being grazed in the spring, right? So, and some of the birds, you know, these are LBJs, little brown jobbies, and lark sparrow and the field sparrow in the lower left, and the LeConte sparrow, which we kind of joke calling it the golden bird. It's really pretty, and not that many around, although a bunch of the birders thought there weren't as many, actually biologists, Cliff Shackelford specifically, but that there weren't that many in the hill country. And actually there are a lot more than we think. And it's, so if we manage this habitat carefully, that will help those birds dramatically. So any questions? I'm going to stop there. I know that's been too long. Actually, one of the things is I dedicate my book, or I dedicate this presentation to my brother Ben, who's up on the upper right with the fish. He died of ALS several years ago, It's also called Lou Gehrig's disease, horrible disease. Basically, your mind's perfectly fine, but your body just quits working. So remember the ice bucket challenge? That was ALS. So if you get a chance, support ALS. And then to my son, Ruf, who was killed about 15 years ago. And actually my portion of the book is dedicated to him. All my royalties go to an endowment fund for doing conservation work on a watershed up in the Ozarks, where we both enjoyed and learned to love the natural world. And also any of the book sales that I make, anything that comes from the book all goes to Rufus Fund. And so, but I'd be happy to answer any questions. I probably ran long, but.
We've got some questions on Zoom, but can we give them a round of applause?
Yeah, thank you. Okay.
Repeat the question for the folks on Zoom.
Absolutely.
Rufus, we had uncontrolled burn up in the Panhandle.
Yeah, right.
And what I'm wondering is, what do you think, or how spectacular will the spring grow out be in there, or what do you foresee as the consequence from a restoration point?
Right. So he was asking about the wildfires that we had in the Panhandle and the impact of those wildfires. They're obviously devastating to livestock operators that were up there, but the big impact for them is that they don't have anything that's in reserve. Everything got burned, like on given ranches, everything was burned. And there is some problem with putting livestock back on freshly burned ground. They tend to overgraze it because it's really lush. And so if you don't have anything else, that's kind of a challenge. That may be kind of the downside of it. The native plant community, I think, is going to be great in the long term. It's going to set back a lot of the brush species that may be invading some of those grasslands in the Panhandle. And it's kind of maybe that, I don't think anybody's looking at the bright side of, the wildfires and the Panhandle. I'll give you an example to go back quite a bit further. So I don't know if y'all remember when the National Park Service made a change in Yellowstone. They made a change that basically they said, we're going to let it burn. And the first big let it burn was Yellowstone. And they had a big wildfire there. This was decades ago. And everybody went, oh, that was horrible. That was a disaster. Now, well, everybody except the biologists and the ecologists went, this is great. And it was just wonderful for the plant community and the diversity that was out there, and the wildlife really responded to that. There's going to be, so we really don't want, wildfires that are that significant as far as the number of acres burned. Although there is who was it? One of the early, it wasn't Lindheimer, it was Romer, I think, who went from New Braunfels and was traveling to Fredericksburg, and he kind of came in from New Braunfels toward the Cibolo and then turned north and went through Fredericksburg and into toward Llano. And the whole time they were traveling, everything had been burned. So that's a massive amount of area that was burned. And that is probably more what we were talking about historically. There are obviously some birds that are going to really get, prairie chicken are going to, lose a lot of nesting cover, and that'd be difficult for them. But that's what all these plant communities and the wildlife are adapted to. So I think from a wildlife and a plant community standpoint, it'll be fine. I think from a livestock range manager standpoint, it's going to be a little dicey at first, but in the long run, they'll probably be in a lot better shape. From the plant community standpoint, probably not financially and maybe never financially. That was pretty devastating. So
Do you have some recommendations for controlling fire ants in residential settings?
yeah, so do I have a recommendation for fire ants in a residential setting? So one of the things is for sure do individual mound treatment. And I prefer growth regulators. If you're going to use a pesticide, is use a growth regulator, which is ant specific. It controls the queen, and basically it takes time for it to happen. If it would ever rain, one of the things that I did in my yard is what happens is fire ants. My sister actually did one of her PhDs on fire ants in Brazil, but what they do, and they're from the Amazon basin, they put their mounds when it rains heavily, when the soil gets saturated, the fire ant mounds just seem to pop up, right? And they bring it all up above. And if you hit that mound, you'll see that there's the eggs, all the eggs. So they move their whole mound above ground when you get a completely saturated soil. They are at the most sensitive at that point, or their colony is most sensitive. The queen's right there, okay, above ground. And so actually, if it floods even more, and we've had that on like the Guadalupe River, that you get balls of fire ants and they're surrounding the queen, and they will float through the water, and the last thing you want to do is bump into one of those, right? And so, but is boiling water. That's the most environmentally sensitive thing you can do. Now, that's hard to do in a pot that has fire ants in it, but in the yard, that's what I've done. And besides, it's tons of fun. Take that. Yeah, so growth regulator is, if you're going to use a pesticide, use a growth regulator. There used to be a product called Logic. They keep changing the names, but it's because it's an ant specific bait. Now we have about 50 species of ants in Bexar County. So it kills all those ants. So that's the reason for mound treatment. Only treat the mound, don't broadcast it over the whole yard.
Many of the birds that you mentioned required several acres for a nesting pair, except I suppose grackles. My question is, for those of us in urban or suburban plots, I don't even know what they are, a tenth of an acre, a fifth of an acre, I don't even know. But is there much benefit to like wildscaping your yard?
Great question. So he said, in an urban setting, most of what I talked about was acreage. And so like 5 acres per pair for the painted bunny. Wrens will actually nest at like a quarter acre, as little as a quarter acre per pair. So if you got a half an acre, you can have 2 pairs of wrens on it. And it has a lot to do also with what your neighbor does. So if you're or if you have a green belt behind you, then that can increase the quality of that. I'll share one, I'll try to do it real quick, is that there is the first wildscape development. We were talking with someone that was at Mainland Square, which was like after the preserve. The preserve was the first one, and it was done next door to McAllister Park. And it was a infill piece. They had developed everything. It's Cross Canyon is the road that goes across. It's before you get to Bitters, Cross Canyon and Joan Smaltzberger. And there is a piece of property. I went and did a presentation at the Botanical Gardens on wildscaping, and there was a developer in the audience. And at the break, he came up to me and he said, I want to do the first wildscape development. And I went, sure. and so he did. Mike Ortman, he contacted me, and actually his partners, and we did I helped them, and I basically went out and said, look, this is what we recommend. Preserve as much of the native plant community as you can when you're building the lot, as you're developing the lots. Basically, if you can do a building envelope, and this is like Andy Wasowski's thing of a Requiem for a Lawnmower. I don't know if anybody's read that, but it is don't, preserve the plant community that's already there and just have a building envelope. that you build the property, the house in. And so they did that. And actually, it was wildly successful. They sold every lot before they even finished the roads, which is unheard of in development arenas. Later, as it matured a little bit, a graduate student, I can't remember where she was from, but a graduate student did her master's work and basically looked at the preserve to see whether that wildscape development would have any benefit, right? And were there more birds there as compared to a traditional yard? And what they used as a control was Government Canyon. And actually it was significantly more like Government Canyon than it was like a traditional yard. And the kinds of birds were mainly, it wasn't seed-eating birds, but insect-eating birds. So there were more insect-eating birds in that development. It's a small, 15 acres maybe, 10, 12 homes. There was actually a creek, and they would have typically, the developer said, we would go across the creek. We would fill and go across the creek and build on the other side too. And they didn't do that. And so it was less expensive in infrastructure, but there was more green space. But that's a great urban example of, yes, it can have an impact and you can actually benefit. And if you can get your neighbors to do it, right? A little bit of thinking that might not happen, but also if you're next to a green space or another park or a natural park, that can improve the quality and the amount of wildlife that you can improve. But it's absolute, we know that it works in urban areas even, so.
Okay, we have time for one more question. Is there a question in the room?
All right, how about back there?
I don't know who was first.
But I'll be around, and so if someone wants to come and ask me a question afterwards, I'm happy.
So in the last 2 years, I've noticed a dramatic drop off in the blue jay population in this area.
Oh.
And I'm curious if the conservation community or Audubon have heard anything about that.
That's a good question. So he was asking about the decline in blue jays in this area. Now, one of the things, when I first came and was working in San Antonio, basically just outside of 410, there were still scrub jays. So, which are now called Woodhouse's scrub jay. They changed the name on us between our two books. But, and what happened is as development happened, blue jays moved them out. So blue jays were spreading their territory as scrub jays were drawing back from their territory, mainly because of development. I have not, someone did mention to me, asked if they had not seen as many blue jays as they had seen in the past. And they were wondering if I knew anything about that. And I don't know if there's anybody else that has any insight to that, but that's an interesting thing. Is there some point where, you know, a tipping point for blue jays where it was better habitat for them as development happened, but then as you know, more development happens, it becomes even poorer quality habitat and they can't survive that.
I did notice that after the big freeze we had, that after that, I stopped hearing them, and even less now.
Right.
So I don't know if something's gotten worse. Or
Yeah. He mentioned that was talking about the big freeze, hurricane or winter storm Uri, and that he seemed to see fewer after that point. We did lose a lot of birds from bird feeder diseases. They were spreading diseases. We lost lots of pine siskins and American goldfinches that were feeding at feeders just a couple weeks after that. So there was a kind of an immediate response where we lost birds. But was there something else going on? I mean, those are the kinds of questions that I'll just say one last thing as I quit, is that much like native plants, there is not much funding for doing research on lots of types of wildlife. Now, other than deer and quail and turkey, there is not much money spent on non-game birds. And so you know, that's something that we should be looking at and that we should be trying to document so we can understand how the systems may be changing and how it's affecting, you know, those birds. Is it something in their, you know, habitat issue, or is it, you know, that they were, or that you have a limited food supply, and when you had a extreme event like that, it challenged the bird population and they began to decline because of that. So there's all kinds of things, but unfortunately, there's not much funding for birds. I'm always struggling to try to find Texas-specific data. There's just not a lot of research. There's not much funding that goes into those out there. So that'd be a great one. I mean, you know, to find out what's going on with blue jays, because they do seem so adaptable, right? They really seem to be an urban bird, a successful urban bird. So why would they be declining? So it's a great question. So thank you. I appreciate y'all having me.
Well, I don't know about you all, but my brain is spinning from all of that amazing information. We do have some plants over in the Plants by Donation. We've got some wine cup seed in the back here. You can see the jar. I think we don't have holders for it, right? So you might have to put them in your pocket or something. But thanks everybody for joining us. That was an amazing presentation. Thank you.